Accessibility at the Museum of Science. Christine Reach, Director of Exhibit Development, co-chair of the Accessibility Committee.
We think about accessibility in three different ways in the museum. The first is one way that many museums think about accessibility, which is making sure that people with disabilities can be physically present within our museum. So we want them to be able to access the museum, to get in using ramps, make sure that there's adequate elevator services, adequate cane detection for people who are blind, but that's only the beginning. We also want people to be able to learn about science, technology, engineering in our museum and have fun doing it. And third, we want to make sure that people with disabilities feel socially included, that they view the museum as a place that's for them, where they can come at any time, and see the museum as a place where they can bring their friends and families and enjoy learning about science together as a group.
Nora Nagel, ADA and 504 Accessibility Coordinator.
Ideally, our goal is to have a visitor with a disability have exactly the same experience as every other visitor. We don't want their visit to be different than anybody else's. We want it to be exactly like everybody else's because that's how it should be.
Early steps toward accessibility. Larry Bell, Senior Vice President for Strategic Initiatives.
I was involved in exhibit development starting back in the late 70s. And I think back then we didn't really have any concept of what accessibility was all about. I think we actually thought that if you made something accessible for one group of people, it made it bad or worse for other people. Back in the mid-1980s, Betty Davidson came to volunteer at the museum. She was a person who had a physical disability, mobility impairment. And she encouraged us politely but insistently that we take an inventory of the accessibility of exhibits in the museum. We came up with the idea of making some changes in this exhibit gallery that we're sitting in right now, the New England Habitats diorama area. The idea was that this was a kind of an exhibit that was totally useless to blind visitors because everything that was available for them to learn was behind glass, depended on you seeing through the glass. So we wanted to look at whether there are ways we could take this space and make it accessible to people who are blind, add things to it to touch, to smell, to listen to, that would help people who are blind get the same ideas that people who are sighted when they come into this exhibit hall. After we developed the additions to this gallery, we evaluated it with people with disabilities and with the general visitors to the museum as well, to see what impact the changes had on all of the audiences that come to the museum. And to our surprise, the exhibit was incredibly better for everyone, not just for the people who had the disabilities.
We also found that the conversation in the gallery went up. People were having a more social experience when they're in the museum. And then finally, the time spent in the exhibition gallery also dramatically increased. So people wanted to be in that gallery more. Once we had that early experience, we realized that we didn't have to choose between designing for people without disabilities and designing for people with disabilities. That when we designed for people with disabilities, it made the experience better for everyone. The museum has had a long-standing history of thinking about the inclusion of people with disabilities. A lot of that early work happened within the exhibitions department, but there were isolated projects and efforts that were taking place across the Museum of Science as a whole. In recent years, we've started working more cohesively together to make sure that the entire museum experience is accessible for people with disabilities.
Results of the NASA Accessibility Review. Britton O'Brien, Vice President of Human Resources, and Wayne Bouchard, Chief Operating Officer.
So probably 5 or 6 years ago, we found ourselves in a dilemma in an area where we thought we were fairly proficient in dealing with issues of accessibility and diversity. It's It was a source of pride in many respects, certainly from exhibit design. Going from that to hearing that we were actually deficient in many areas in terms of our thinking, and kind of being put on notice caught us by surprise. And we immediately went into high gear and turned that into a positive, and in a very short amount of time, going from a deficiency perspective to now hopefully NASA considering us one of their best practice institutions.
After the NASA audit, we engaged the Institute for Human-Centered Design. It's located here in Boston, to come in as a consultant and do a very thorough review and of the facility, and to give us suggestions on what we could do to improve the facility. And they came up with a very specific group of suggestions. They brought in a number of community groups, people for varying types of disabilities, and they were a delight to work with, and they really gave us something to work from.
Advice to other museums.
So if there's one piece of advice I would give to another exhibits department, it would be to work closely with people with disabilities. That's a way that you can really learn how to change your practices and become a more inclusive organization. So hiring people with disabilities to be a part of your department is critical. And that includes making sure that your work environment is inclusive of people with disabilities. Bringing in volunteers with disabilities. There's many job life skills groups that want people with disabilities to have the opportunity to learn job skills, and they can use your museum as a resource, and you learn about disability at the same time. You can also hire people with disabilities to serve as consultants on exhibition teams. When you do that, that person becomes a member of your exhibition team, and you're always cognizant that you're creating an experience that will work for that particular friend and colleague. And then finally, testing out exhibit components with people with disabilities as part of your prototyping process is also another critical way that you can learn to be more inclusive.
The advice that I would give to an institution thinking about making accessibility a higher priority, or something that they want to do a better job of, is to look at it as an opportunity rather than a deficiency or a problem, because it truly is something that is beneficial to everyone that comes through the organization, visitors, staff. Everyone benefits from an effective accessibility program. It's not something that you want to approach from a policing perspective. That's not a good incentive.
What's next?
The more we work with people with disabilities, the more we learn about what it takes to create an accessible environment. So if we're always in this continuous improvement framework, we're always going to get better at being inclusive, and that's where I want us to be.
I don't see this ever ending. It's just a way of life, and becomes more and more ingrained in the institution, not only with the exhibits that we produce, but the population that we want to employ and the population that we want to engage in the museum.
Yeah, and a big goal for us is to be a best practice institution. We pride ourselves in being a leader in this area. We want to walk the talk, so I feel like we are. But as Britt said, it's never done.